There's a street in the older part of town where the lights never stay lit. They flicker soft, uncertain like candles about to give in to the wind. Beneath one of those weary lamps, where pavement cracks like veins through broken concrete, a girl sits each night with her knees pulled close to her chest. Her name is Alina. The world rushes by in cars and hurried footsteps, but she remains still, counting small silver circles with fingers that tremble not from fear, but from the cold. She keeps them in a pocket stitched and restitched too many times. Each coin, a decision. Rent or rice, shoes or soap. Today or tomorrow, she works the early morning shift at the bakery down the alley. It's the kind of place that smells like childhood, warm, sweet, distant. But Alina never tastes what she bakes. She wears gloves, not for hygiene, but to hide the calluses. Her body moves through the motions of kneading, rolling, slicing, serving. But her spirit floats somewhere above the flour, watching quietly, waiting for something unnamed. She rents a room no bigger than a sigh. The walls are thin, the window cracked, and when it rains, it drips onto the one place the mattress isn't torn. Still, she lights a candle each night, not for brightness, but for hope. A ritual, a rebellion, a reminder. Pride is a strange kind of hunger. It feeds on nothing but keeps you standing. Alina never begs. She never asks. Not even when her stomach knots into itself. Not even when she wraps her coat tighter, pretending it's not 2 winters too old. Her pride won't let her fall completely. She tells herself, maybe tomorrow I'll eat. And in that lie, she finds the strength to endure one more day. There are dreams tucked into her pocket, scrambled, forgotten, half-burned things. She once wanted to be a nurse. She once had a fiancé. She once had parents. But loss, like water, finds the cracks in everything. Now all she has is the soft sound of coins sliding against each other, and the silence between the city's heartbeat. Watches the people who pass her. Some glance, most don't. The ones who do, look away quickly, as if her struggle is contagious, as if eye contact might cost them something they're unwilling to give. But Alina notices everything. The mother yelling into her phone, dragging a child behind. The man in the tailored coat, tossing a sandwich into the trash. The old couple walking in silence, their fingers brushing but never quite holding. In the stillness of poverty, she becomes a quiet witness to the noise of the world. Sometimes, late at night, she speaks to no one in particular. A whisper into the wind. A wish, not a prayer. Prayers are for those who still believe someone is listening. She dreams in the colors of things she can't touch. Scarlet dresses in windows. Cakes behind glass. Soft blankets she sees in magazine clippings. Her hunger isn't just in her belly. It's in her eyes, her ribs, her voice, when she says nothing and everything at once. Beneath that flickering light, time doesn't move like it does elsewhere. It loops, repeats, counts down with each drop of change in her palm. People say rock bottom is loud, but it's not. It's quiet. It's a girl sitting on cold concrete with ashes in her pocket, where dreams used to be. And yet she sits, and yet she wakes, and yet she counts, because something in her still believes in tomorrow, even if it's just one breath at a time. And in that belief, fragile as it is, a story begins. Not with triumph, not with light, but with the soft, steady sound of survival. One coin, one breath, one more night beneath the broken sky. There's a silence beneath the bridge that doesn't match the city. It sits heavy in the air, thick with exhaust, old rain, and something older still. Maybe memory, maybe grief. Every evening, after her shift ends and the last of the light slips behind the concrete skyline, Alina passes that place, the underpass just beyond the bakery's alley. She keeps her eyes low, steps careful, never lingering. But tonight, something makes her pause. There's a man there, alone. Not unusual. This city forgets its people often. But this one is different. He doesn't sit with a cup or cardboard plea. Doesn't mutter, doesn't move. Just rests his back against the pillar and stares skyward through the cracks between rusted girders, as if he's waiting for stars that never show themselves here. His beard is unkempt, thick with time. His clothes hang from his frame like they're remembering a body that once fit them. And yet, he doesn't look broken, not in the way most do know. There's something else, a kind of stillness that doesn't come from peace, but from being emptied. Alina keeps walking, but her heart stutters, disturbed by a ripple she can't explain. The next night, he's there again. Same spot, same posture, eyes fixed upward. This time, she watches longer. tries to read his outline like a forgotten poem, and then louder than the wind he hums. A melody, gentle, uneven, familiar. She freezes. It's not possible. It's a tune she hasn't heard in years. A melody once whistled through kitchen walls while someone chopped onions or danced in socks on linoleum floors. A lullaby buried beneath time and pain. She doesn't know why, but her chest tightens. She crosses the street, pretending to tie her shoe. Anything to linger, to listen. The hum stops. She glances back. He hasn't looked at her, hasn't moved, but something in her gut twists, the kind of twist that only comes when the past brushes against the present and says, "Remember me." She walks faster. That night, in her small, silent room, the candle flickers against the window pane. She sits on the mattress and tries to shake the feeling off. But the melody echoes, stubborn and soft, like a memory trying to resurface. Who was he? Why that tune? Her fingers absent-mindedly trace the hem of her coat. Her other hand still aches from kneading dough. In her dreams, the man is standing instead of sitting. And in the dream, he turns to her, but his face is always just out of view, as if the city itself won't let her see too much. Too fast. The following evening, she takes the long way to avoid the bridge. But the melody finds her anyway, hummed by a child at a corner, played by a busker out of tune, whispered in the rattle of the train rails. It's everywhere now. The man said nothing, asked for nothing, but somehow, without a word, he's spoken, louder than anyone has in years. There are many kinds of hunger in this world. Some live in the belly, others in the heart, and some hide so deeply they only show themselves when an old song cracks the silence, and Alina, without knowing why, is starting to feel that hunger rise, not for food, but for answers, for memory, for the face behind the hum. The bridge waits, as it always does, unchanged, uncaring. But now, she is the one who can't stay away. Something about that man is pulling at the edges of her, unraveling a thread she thought long severed, and though she doesn't know it yet, the thread leads back to a story she never finished writing. A story that began long before hunger, long before loss, long before she ever learned how to be alone. There are days that pass like mist, soft, forgettable, and then there are days that cut a line straight through your life, dividing it into before and after. For Alina, that line was drawn on the morning she became a bride without a groom. She remembers everything, not just the pain, but the color of the sky, the scent of jasmine sewn into her veil, the gentle creak of the church doors that never opened wide enough to welcome the man she loved. The white dress fit perfectly. She had chosen it months in advance. A modest thing, timeless, the kind of dress meant for quiet promises and unshakable vows. She had stood before the mirror, hands trembling not from nerves, but from joy. Her heart was full then, full of certainty, full of him. Rayan. He had been light in her darker seasons, the one who remembered her favorite tea, who saved sunflowers from the edge of wilt. He was the steady warmth she'd held on to when everything else slipped through her fingers, until the day he slipped away to . No calls, no notes, no car outside. The chapel, just silence, and time stretching out like an echo that refused to end. Her mother had whispered empty comforts. The priest looked down, pretending not to see her shaking. Guests shuffled awkwardly, their pity too loud, but Alina stood still, as if by not moving, she could stop time, as if the universe would notice the wrongness and undo it. He loved her, didn't he? She whispered it to herself like a prayer, over and over. The only thing she had left. The hours passed. Dusk rolled in like a quiet thief, stealing what little hope remained. She waited until the candles dimmed and the music fell silent. Then she took off the veil, folded it neatly, and walked home in her wedding dress, alone. In the days that followed, no one knew what to say. Friends became ghosts. Her phone filled with half-hearted texts. Maybe he got scared. Maybe something happened. Maybe you're better off. But none of it mattered. None of it changed the fact that he was gone. And no one, not even her, knew why. She searched, at first gently, then desperately. Hospitals, friends, even the police. There was no trail, no accident, no sign. As if the man she loved had been plucked from existence in one cruel moment, and in his place, silence. Years passed, not quickly, but in slow, bitter increments, like snow falling one flake at a time, until the world turns white with grief. She learned how to smile again, not because she wanted to, but because people stop asking questions when you pretend to. Healed. She boxed up the dress, slid it under the bed, and promised herself she'd stop counting anniversaries. But the body remembers what the mind tries to forget, and now, in the present, with the sound of that strange man's hum still ringing in her ears, the memory surfaces again, not like a wave, but like smoke, creeping in around the edges. The ache doesn't come from anger, not anymore. It comes from not knowing, from the way the world kept spinning without offering her a reason, from the unfinished sentence that still lingers in the back of her throat. He loved me, didn't he? She says it aloud sometimes, when no one's near, not to be answered, but to remind herself that once it felt true. Because even now, with all the time and distance that's passed, there's a part of her that still waits, still wonders, still stands in a quiet chapel in her mind, staring at the doors, hoping they'll open, not because she needs him to return, but because she never understood why he left. And when pain arrives without reason, it carves deeper now. The memory lives behind her, ice never too far, never fully gone, and in the face of a man beneath a bridge, humming a forgotten melody, something in her begins to shift, because the past doesn't knock. It creeps in quietly, wearing a familiar face. The morning air carried the scent of flour and ash, that quiet blend only found in bakeries where old ovens still breathe. Alina's fingers were dusted white, wrists sore from hours of kneading dough that would never make it to her own plate. But this morning felt different, heavier. She couldn't stop thinking about the man beneath the bridge. All night, his melody had threaded itself into her dreams, unraveling pieces of her past she thought were stitched tightly shut. That tune, soft, uneven, familiar, had burrowed its way into her chest like a splinter. She didn't know his name, didn't know his story, but something about him felt unfinished, like a sentence paused mid-thought. As the bakery emptied out and sunlight spilled over cracked sidewalks, she took one croissant from the batch that was meant to be sold. A small act, a quiet one, still warm, still soft. She wrapped it in a napkin and slipped it into her coat pocket, not out of charity, not out of duty, but because something inside here, fragile and curious, needed to know who he really was. The bridge sat in its usual silence, grey, unmoving, a place where time folded in on itself. He was there, just as before, seated with his back to the cold stone pillar, knees drawn up, head tilted to the sky like he was listening to something far away. Alina slowed her steps. She felt unsure, like stepping into someone else's memory. The croissant in her pocket radiated a little warmth against her side, but her hands had already begun to shake. She approached without a word. He didn't look at her, didn't flinch, only his breathing changed slower, deeper. She crouched beside him and extended the wrapped croissant with quiet hesitation. Her fingers found his as he reached to take it, and in that moment, everything inside her stilled. His skin was rough, cracked from cold and time, but it trembled, just slightly, as if unused to kindness. Their hands touched for barely a second, but it was enough to notice how familiar that tremble felt, how the lines on his knuckles mirrored ones she once kissed beneath summer light. He avoided her gaze, turned his face downward, letting his hair fall like a curtain, but not before she caught a glimpse. Eyes, faded, tired, but a color she remembered, the same shade Rayan had, not similar, the same dot her breath caught somewhere between ribs. She didn't speak. Couldn't. He took the croissant slowly, cradling it with both hands like it was something sacred, and then he began to hum again, the same melody, not loud, not direct, just enough to sting. Alina stood in silence for a long while, watching, listening, remembering. It was impossible, illogical, cruel, but something in her, the part that had once stood at an altar waiting for a man who never came, began to whisper, a possibility she had locked away long ago. She left without saying a word. The bridge grew smaller behind her. The warmth from the croissant faded, but her fingers still held the shape of his dot, and for the first time in years, she wasn't sure what hurt more, what had been taken from her, or what might still remain. The city moved around her as if it had somewhere better to be. Cars hissed through shallow puddles. A tram bell rang in the distance. Someone laughed from a corner cafe, the sound too bright for the grey morning. But Alina's world had narrowed into something quiet and small. It had been 2 days since she handed him the croissant, 2 days since their fingers brushed, and 1,000 ghosts stirred awake inside her. She hadn't returned since, not because she didn't want to, but because she wasn't ready to know. The mind does strange things when it wants to protect the heart. It blurs memories, dulls details, tells you that eyes are just eyes, and a voice is just a trick of wind. But a part of her knew, not in the way facts are known, but the way music lives inside your bones. Even after years of silence, she went back on the third day. The bridge loomed ahead, as unchanged as the man beneath it. He sat hunched, his coat pulled tighter, legs drawn in, as if holding himself together with nothing but will. Alina watched him for a moment from across the street, hidden behind a delivery van. She wasn't ready to speak, just to see Dot. And that's when it happened. He shifted, slowly, stood to stretch, and as he did, something slipped from his coat pocket, falling silently to the ground. A watch, old, cracked. Across the glass. Dot, she blinked, stepped closer, her heart stumbling in her chest. It was unmistakable. The mismatched strap, the faint scratch on the silver casing, the little engraving on the side barely visible now, worn down by time. R+A, until the stars forget to shine. She had given it to Rayan 2 years before he disappeared. A birthday gift, cheap but meaningful. He wore it every day. Said it reminded him of time spent, not time lost. And now, it sat there in the dirt, resting between fallen leaves and cigarette butts, as if it hadn't carried an entire love story once. She bent down to pick it up, her hands trembling. It can't be. The thought rang in her head, louder than any traffic, sharper than memory. But there it was, real, heavy, cold in her palm. She looked up. He hadn't noticed, still adjusting his coat, still lost in that slow way of moving, like someone not used to being seen. Dot, she held the watch to her chest, suddenly breathless. It was like holding a piece of the past that had slipped through time and landed at her feet. She wanted to call out, to shout his name, to demand the truth, but her voice caught. Because what if she was wrong? What if it was all a coincidence? Eyes, the hum, the trembling hands, the watch. And what if it wasn't? She stepped back into shadow, fingers curled tightly around the cracked silver. 100 memories rushed in. Rayan, laughing as she blindfolded him for the surprise gift. The way he had smiled when he unwrapped it. The way he held her hand and said, "Now I'll never be late for you again." And then the day he disappeared. The unanswered calls, the sleepless nights, the silence that swallowed everything. And now, this impossible watch. She walked home slowly, the watch tucked deep inside her coat. The world felt quieter now, heavier, as if something unseen had shifted in the background. In her room she lit the candle again, watched the flame flicker, placed the watch beside it, careful not to smudge the glass any further. Her heart ached not from fresh pain, but from the strange weight of maybe. Maybe it was him. Maybe he had never really left. Maybe he had simply become someone else, under different clothes, behind a different silence. The questions pressed against her ribs like a heartbeat. If it's him, why didn't he come back? Why this silence? Why now? But there were no answers yet. Only a watch and a name that still lived beneath her breath. Alina stared at it long into the night. Time moved, but something deeper had frozen still, and all she could do was wait for it to begin again. There are moments when the world goes quiet, not because the noise has stopped, but because something inside you has risen above it. That's how it feels as Alina walks toward the bridge. The morning light filters through low clouds, pale and diffused, turning the city into something softer than it really is. But inside her, there's no softness, only the steady, rising thud of a heart that doesn't know what it's walking toward. The cracked watch is in her coat pocket. Its weight pulls at her like an anchor, both grounding and unbearable. She doesn't know what she's expecting. A confession, a collapse, a truth that makes everything make sense. But when she sees him sitting in the same place, back against the same pillar, eyes turned away, none of those things happen. He looks up as she approaches, just briefly, and something changes, not in him, but in her, because in that brief glance, she sees it, not a stranger, not a vagrant, but Rayan. Or whatever version of him remains. His face is weathered, the edges roughened by time, by loss, by something deeper than either of those. But behind the exhaustion, behind the scruff and the shadows, his eyes are the same, not just in color, but in the way they hold too much, like a glass too full to move. She steps closer, her voice barely audible above the wind. He doesn't answer, doesn't even flinch, just turns his face to the side, as if even the act of looking at her might break something inside him that's already cracked. She stands there, unsure of what to do with her hands, her breath, the ache building in her throat. Everything inside her wants to shake him, to ask 100 questions that have no good answers. But instead, she waits, and he stays silent. His silence is heavy, thicker than words, louder than any scream. It surrounds them like fog, turning the space between them into a kind of haunted pause. She can feel her pulse in her ears, can feel memory pressing against her like a tide. The boy who once wrote her notes on napkins, who once whispered dreams in the dark, gone, end in his place. This man with tired bones and unspeakable stories. Still, she doesn't move, because something tells her this moment matters more than all the ones that came before, even if no one speaks, even if nothing is said. Because silence, too, can carry meaning, especially when it comes from someone who once knew how to make the world feel alive. A breeze moves through, lifting strands of her hair, brushing dust from his coat. The sky overhead is the same grey-blue they used to lie under in the park, when life felt like something they were just beginning to write. Now it feels like a book missing half its pages. Alina watches him as he stares at the concrete, not in shame, not in fear, but in some place far beyond either, like he's already lived 1,000 lifetimes in the space between their last goodbye and this moment. Her throat tightens. She wants to speak his name, to break the spell, but she doesn't, because deep down, she knows that sometimes people disappear, not because they want to, but because they believe they don't deserve to return, and the man in front of her isn't ready to come back yet. Not really. Still, she steps closer, not to confront, not to demand, but to witness, to say with her presence, I see you, even if you can't say a word, even if the past has turned your voice into ash. He doesn't meet her eyes again, and she doesn't ask him to. Instead, she stands with him a moment longer, then quietly turns, leaving the cracked watch on the ledge beside him. She walks away without looking back. But in her chest, something shifts, not healing, not yet, but the beginning of understanding. And in the still air behind her, his silence lingers, not empty, but full of all the words he still can't say. There's something strange about the way silence echoes, not the quiet of an empty room, but the silence between two people, one begging for answers, the other refusing to speak. She returns to the bridge like someone returning to the scene of a dream, one she can't wake up from, and one that won't let her go. The man is already there, hunched, small, a figure blurred by mist and memory. Her footsteps are sharp against the concrete, unsteady, tired, determined. In her chest, something fragile tightens like a string pulled too far, ready to snap. She watches him for a moment. No words, no movement, just a wind brushing against her coat and her thoughts screaming beneath her calm. Then something erupts. The pain, the confusion, the weight of days lived in not knowing all of it, ignites like dry leaves catching flame. Her voice rises before she can stop it. Who are you? She asks, or maybe demands. He doesn't answer. Why do you look like him? Still, nothing. Only his shoulders tightening slightly. A flicker in the way he exhales him is. It's unbearable, the resemblance, the refusal, the unbearable possibility that maybe, just maybe, she's not going mad. Her voice shakes. This time not from fury, but from the ache of being broken too many times in the same place. He's gone, she says quietly. I know that, but her voice doesn't sound convinced. She steps closer. Not enough to touch, but close enough to feel the chill that surrounds him. Not the kind the weather brings, but the kind that lives in people who have forgotten how to be seen. He turns just slightly, not to face her, but to acknowledge the air between them. His profile catches the grey light, and then something happens. A blink, a pause, a shimmer in his eyes. They glisten, not dramatically, not loudly, but in that soft, terrifying way that tears begin. The first tear doesn't fall, it hovers. His jaw tightens, but she sees it, and it breaks her open in ways she didn't expect. He says nothing. He doesn't need to, because that tear, that single, stubborn tear, says more than 1,000 confessions ever could. She stares at him, breath held, time slowing. A part of her wants to scream. Another part wants to kneel beside him and beg for truth, for closure, for something that makes sense. But she does neither. She just stands there watching a man who wears the same eyes as the ghost who once loved her. Her voice, now soft, almost crumbling, barely makes it past her lips. Please, just leave me alone. And it surprises even her, because even though she wanted answers, maybe what she needed more was space. A step back from the edge of something too big to name. She turns to walk away. Each step feels heavier than the last. The world doesn't stop spinning. The wind doesn't hold its breath. No music plays. Just the rhythm of footsteps and the ache in her chest. Behind her, she knows he's still there, watching or not. It doesn't matter, because something has shifted, not just in the air, but in her. She doesn't know what it is yet, but she can feel it, like the first tremor before the earth moves. And though she told him to leave her alone, part of her knows this story isn't done, not yet. Night folds gently over the city, tucking the streets beneath a hush that only the lonely ever truly hear. Streetlights flicker like old memories, half alive, half forgotten. And somewhere in that quiet, Alina walks, her footsteps soft, almost unsure. She's following him, not out of malice, not even out of hope, just a need to understand. He walks with a weight that pulls him into himself, as if every step costs something. He doesn't look back, doesn't sense her presence. Maybe he's too far gone for that. Maybe some hearts forget how to feel the eyes that once loved them. He weaves through alleyways and forgotten sidewalks, until the buildings give way to shadows and overgrowth. An old park silent and worn waits. Ahead, Alina freezes. The rusted gate creaks as he enters, swallowed by ivy and time. She hangs back, just far enough to remain unseen. But she knows this place. She knows it too well. This was their place, years ago, when the world felt brighter, when laughter came easier. There, beneath that old oak tree, he once carved her name, with trembling hands and promises too big for teenage hearts. Now, the bark has thickened, burying letters in its scars. The bench is cracked. The swing groans in the wind. Even the air feels older. She watches him stop at the tree, watches him kneel, slowly, like someone visiting a grave. The city is distant, now only the whisper of wind and the rustle of dying leaves remain. Then he cries. No sound, no heaving breath, just a stillness that speaks louder than wailing ever could. His shoulders tremble. One hand clutches the base of the tree, the other pressed against his face. Alina doesn't move. She doesn't even breathe, because in that moment, something inside her begins to unravel, not from fear, not even from sadness, but from truth. The truth that pain leaves echoes, and sometimes those echoes wear familiar faces. She stares at his silhouette, curled beneath the branches where laughter once lived, and all the questions she clung to, every accusation, every disbelief, they dissolve because grief has its own language. And now she understands. Not everything broken was meant to be fixed. Not every answer was meant to be found. But some moments like this one live forever, in the ache of a memory, in the silence, beneath an old oak. In the way one's soul breaks quietly for another. She turns before he sees her, before the world snaps back into shape. Tears stream down her face, uninvited, unashamed. And with every step she takes away from that park, something inside her shifts, not healed, not whole. But changed. Forever. The night settles like dust on forgotten shelves, quiet, heavy, and full of things unsaid. Alina sits alone in the half-light of a stranger's home that used to feel like a memory. The ticking of the clock fades into the background, drowned beneath the rhythm of his breath as he sleeps in the next room. Peaceful, or maybe just pretending. She doesn't know why she's here. Not really. Maybe curiosity, maybe longing, or maybe it's that strange ache that grows in the space between distance and closure. Her fingers move slowly across the edge of his desk. The wood is worn, stained by time and things he never shared. And then, something, tucked beneath a stack of old receipts and unopened bills, creased, folded, half lost beneath the clutter of avoidance. She finds it. A letter, crushed at the corners, torn at the fold. But her name is there, written in the handwriting she once knew by heart. She hesitates. The weight of it in her hands feels almost too much. But she opens it, and the world shifts. "I'm sorry I disappeared. I never meant to hurt you." The words hit like the wind before a storm, gentle, then overwhelming. They spill out, line by line, raw, unfinished, like someone trying to bleed truth through a pen that kept stalling. He writes about the silence, about how it swallowed him whole, about the nights he thought, about calling but couldn't find the version of himself who deserved to hear her voice again. He confesses to fear not of her, but of what she saw in him. of the mirror she unknowingly held up every time she loved him without asking why. And then he writes that some people vanish not to be cruel, but because they believe the leaving might hurt less than the staying. Alina's hands tremble. She reads it again and again, slowly, as if memorizing each sentence might stitch the past back together. But this letter was never meant to be read. It was never sent, never even sealed, just written, folded, forgotten, left to collect dust in the shadows of his guilt. And yet here it is. Every word a small unraveling of a story she thought she already knew. She sits back, eyes closed, letter pressed to her chest. The room around her doesn't change, but something inside her does. Not forgiveness, not yet, maybe not ever, but a soft understanding, the kind that only comes when silence is finally broken, even if it comes too late. The letter doesn't explain everything. It doesn't erase the absence, or the weight she carried while he vanished into quiet, but it leaves behind a trace of the man who disappeared. And in that trace, she finds the peace she never knew she was waiting for. Not answers, but truth. However fractured, however light, it's still truth. Outside, morning is starting to stretch its light across the window pane. The world is still turning, still moving forward. She folds the letter once more, not to hide it, but to keep it. Some things aren't meant to be returned. They're meant to be remembered, not for what they were, but for what they finally revealed. She finds him again, sitting where the morning barely reaches on the edge of a half-lit porch, eyes lost in the spaces between. The wind plays softly through the trees above, brushing past them like the presence of something unspoken. This time, she doesn't ask. And yet, he speaks. His voice arrives in pieces, rough and barely there, like something unused for too long. I thought I'd die before you saw me like this. The words fall between them with the weight of a confession, and the silence afterward is heavier, still sacred and raw. Then slowly, the fragments of his story begin to unfold. The night of the accident had not been loud or dramatic. Just a single moment, the screech of tires, the crush of glass, the confusion of breath and blood. One blink too late, and the world split in two. He tells her how he woke up in a hospital that smelled of antiseptic and grief. How, for weeks, he drifted in and out of pain that had no beginning and no end. His body had survived, barely, but his spirit, something in it, broke beyond repair. He remembers trying to reach for her name in those early days, not to call it out, not even to speak it, just to hold it in his mind like a lifeline. But shame pulled harder. He tells her about the hospital bills, the guilt he carried, the sense that he had nothing left to offer her except a broken version of the man she used to know. So he disappeared, not out of cruelty, but out of fear, out of love, twisted by despair, out of the belief that vanishing would hurt her less than being forced to love a shadow. He spent months in rehabilitation, not just for his wounds but for his choices. Days blurred together in sterile rooms with clocks that ticked too loudly, nights haunted by the memory of her. Laughter, the one thing he couldn't erase. He speaks of debt, both financial and emotional, and how it clung to him like a second skin. Every step forward felt like sinking, every attempt to rebuild, a reminder of what was lost. She listens, still, no interruption, no judgment, just the stillness of someone bearing witness. He lowers his head. "I wasn't ready to see your eyes again," he whispers, "not until I had something to give back." And then he says nothing more. The moment stretches, gentle, sorrowful, real. Alina stands in front of him, not sure if her heart is breaking or simply softening in places she had sealed shut. Her breath trembles in her chest. Her hands feel both heavy and light, because for the first time she sees the full shape of his pain, the contours of the man behind the silence, the reasons wrapped in wounds he never thought he deserved to share. And in those scars, she sees not just hurt but survival, not just distance but the remnants of a love too scared to reach, love still there, faint, uncertain, but not gone. The wind shifts again. She doesn't speak, she doesn't move, she just watches him, and for the first time, he lets her. The ghosts between them begin to lose their shape. They do not disappear. Not yet, perhaps never. But in this fragile space, this stillness carved by truth, they begin to breathe again. Together, the sky darkened without warning, a slow folding of light into grey. Alina walked alone, her breath shallow, her footsteps uneven. Across the cracked pavement, behind her, silence stretched, thick with everything unsaid. It wasn't just the air that felt heavy. It was the years, the waiting, the ache that lived unnamed inside her chest. Then, the rain began, not gently, not like forgiveness. It came in a sudden, bitter downpour, as if the sky itself had been holding back until now. She didn't run, she didn't flinch. The water clung to her hair, traced her jaw, soaked into her clothes, but she kept walking, one step after the other, away from him. Behind her, he stood still, his silhouette blurred by the falling rain, his body a statue of regret. She didn't need to look back. She felt him there, not with her, not gone, just suspended in that terrible space between holding on and letting go. For a moment, her mind reached back to a memory, two shadows tangled under the same sky, laughing, running through this very street as teenagers. No umbrellas, no fear, only the rain and the joy of being together. Now the same rain felt colder, crueler, filled with the weight of everything they couldn't repair. She stopped. Her heart pounded with a strange rhythm, part fury, part longing. The sound of water slapping against the sidewalk filled the silence, but in her chest there was thunder, the kind that builds when love turns into something unrecognizable. Slowly, she turned to face him. He hadn't moved, not a single step. His head was lowered, his shirt soaked, arms limp at his sides, like he was standing in a storm he believed he deserved. Alina's voice came soft, almost lost in the rain. "You said you loved me, ... then vanished." The words were small, but they broke something open. In both of them. He looked up then. There were no excuses in his eyes, no defenses, just the quiet devastation of a man who had run from the one thing that ever felt like home. Alina stared at him, and in that moment between the raindrops, the heartbreak, the soaked silence, she realized this wasn't just about what he had done. It was about what they had become. Two people standing in the wreckage of something once beautiful, now unrecognizable. He took a breath, but didn't speak. There was nothing he could say that would undo the time, the distance, the silence. So he just stood there, and she just watched. The rain didn't stop. It didn't care for stories or closure. It just kept falling. Alina turned again, her eyes stinging not from the rain, her fists clenched at her sides, but her heart betrayed her. Because even now, even after everything, a part of her still wanted to run back, still wanted to believe. But love wasn't just about wanting. It was about showing up, and he hadn't. So she walked away again, not because she didn't love him, but because love, real love, demands more than a broken apology in the rain. Behind her, he watched until her shape dissolved into the storm. He didn't call out, didn't chase. Maybe he knew this time he'd waited too long, and she kept walking, her chest cracking open, the past flooding in with each step, not drowning, but not quite breathing either. The rain washed over everything, the street, the trees, the memories. It blurred the world like a smeared painting, one they'd once painted together. Only now, the colors had run. She didn't know if she'd forgive him, didn't know if this was truly the end. But for now, all she had was the storm, and the knowledge that loving someone doesn't always mean staying. Sometimes, it means knowing when to let go. And as she disappeared into the gray, he remained, a quiet ruin in the rain. The days passed slowly, each hour dragging like the weight of an old sorrow that refused to leave. The kind of ache that didn't scream but whispered, constantly, softly, in everything. In the wind against the windows, in the rustling of old leaves, in the empty spaces where his voice used to be. She hadn't seen him since the rain, since she'd walked away, heart torn in half. But something about that moment, him standing in the downpour, silent, soaked, shivering, but still kept replaying in her mind like an unfinished sentence. She couldn't escape it, couldn't forget the way he looked at her like someone asking to be seen for the first time, or maybe the last. So, after days of silence, she returned. The air was gray that morning, overcast skies, pale light. The world felt muted, as if holding its breath. The old house still stood, sagging under the weight of memories. Time hadn't changed much, but he had. He looked worse now, his body thinner, his skin paler. A frailness had settled over him, quiet and devastating. His clothes hung loose on his frame, like they no longer recognized the man wearing them. The stubble on his face was unshaven, eyes sunken, and yet he was awake, sitting on the small wooden bench outside, hunched slightly forward, not waiting, just existing. She stood across the street for a moment, watching, and then she crossed. No words, no hesitation. just steps slow, sure, quiet. He didn't notice her at first. His gaze was lost somewhere distant, somewhere unreachable, until her shadow fell over his shoes. He looked up and saw her. There were no speeches, no dramatic revelations, no explanations rehearsed or prepared. Only the quiet truth that hung between them, shared heavy and wordless. Then she stepped forward, and hugged him, a full, aching embrace. Arms wrapped around him like a memory being rewritten in real time, like a vow whispered not with words, but warmth. It wasn't gentle, it wasn't delicate, it was desperate, real. Her arms held him like they were afraid he'd vanish again. At first, he didn't move. His body stiffened under her touch, like he didn't know how to receive it. But then he broke, all of him. The tears came suddenly, a storm without warning. His chest heaved, shaking like something deep inside had finally cracked, open like the weight he carried had become too much for one heart to bear alone. And now, he wasn't alone. He collapsed into her, shoulders trembling, face buried against her neck, hands gripping her shirt like an anchor in a storm. He didn't sob loudly. His pain was quiet, fractured, raw, but it was real, and she felt every shudder of it, every unspoken apology, every second he'd spent in silence, in shame, in hiding. She didn't say anything. She didn't need to, because in that moment, the hug said everything. It said, "You're still here." It said, "I see you." It said, "I never stopped." Minutes passed, or maybe hours. Time no longer mattered, just the closeness. Just the simple truth of two people finding each other again, not perfectly, not easily, but honestly. When he finally pulled back, eyes swollen, breath uneven, he couldn't meet her gaze, but she looked at him, fully, softly, and for the first time in a long time, he didn't feel like a ghost. He felt human, wounded, flawed, but still breathing, still held. It was not a fix, not a fairy tale ending. The world hadn't healed in that embrace, but something had shifted. A door cracked open, a silence broken, a hand reached out and taken, and that mattered because sometimes the most powerful stories don't end in fireworks or words. Sometimes they end in a hug and a heart that says, "I'm still here, even after everything, even after the rain, even after the silence. Still here, still holding on." The light outside was soft that morning, hushed, like the sky itself didn't want to intrude on what was about to be said. Rayan sat with his hands clasped, knuckles pale, shoulders drawn inward like a man trying to hide inside his own ribs. Alina sat across from him, quiet, not impatient, not demanding, just waiting. There was something sacred in silence, and something terrifying too. He looked different now, older, not in years, but in weight, like the months had hung stones around his neck. The man who once stood tall, proud, slightly mischievous, was now a figure chipped away by time and shame. When he finally spoke, his voice was almost too soft to catch. It cracked, but the words came anyway. He told her everything, the version she had imagined 100 times, where he walked away by choice, not the one where betrayal stained his hands. No, his story was not neat, it was brutal. He hadn't vanished, he was taken. A walk home turned wrong. A corner to quiet, hands, fists, shouts, then nothing. He was found in an alley, barely breathing. They took his phone, his wallet, and weeks of his life. He was in a coma, unclaimed, unknown, a stranger with a fractured skull, and a name no one called. And when he woke up, the world had moved on without him. He was confused, lost, disoriented in a hospital room where the light never changed, and the nurses always smiled too gently. He didn't remember his name for days. By the time memory returned, so had the shame. Everything was gone. His savings, his apartment, his job, and with them, his pride. He had nothing but scars, and the echo of a life he didn't know how to re-enter. Told her he thought of her every day, every single day. But what could he offer now? A man with empty pockets and trembling hands. He convinced himself she'd be better off without the ghost he'd become. So, he didn't return. Not because he didn't love her, but because he did. That was the part that broke something open in her. The idea that love could be the reason someone disappears. His voice wavered when he said, "I couldn't let you see me like that. Broken, useless, a reminder of everything I failed to be." And yet, here he was, still breathing, still broken, but speaking. There was something painful in hearing the truth. but there was also something sacred about it, something cleansing. As if the version of Rayon she held onto, the one who chose to leave, was being gently replaced by the man in front of her, the one who had fought to survive. It didn't make the hurt vanish. It didn't erase the months of silence, but it rewrote the story she'd told herself in the dark. He had never stopped loving her. He just didn't believe he deserved to. And now, with nothing left to lose, he gave her the only thing he had left, the truth. He sat still when he finished, like someone awaiting judgment. He didn't plead, didn't ask for forgiveness. He simply offered his story. The air between them was full of things unsaid: grief, love, the fragile hope that maybe, just maybe, it wasn't too late. And Alina, she didn't cry, not yet, but her silence changed. It softened, because sometimes love doesn't come wrapped in perfect timing or clean endings. Sometimes it returns with broken teeth and bruised knuckles. Sometimes it stumbles back to you, not to be rescued, but to say, I tried. And that matters too. In that small, quiet room, surrounded by faded light and chipped walls, a story once buried beneath shame and fear finally found its voice. And for the first time in a long time, so did he. The pavement was cold beneath them, but neither moved, not because it was comfortable, but because it felt honest, concrete beneath the spine, air damp with memory, the kind of silence that doesn't demand filling, just understanding. They sat side by side, two silhouettes etched in the glow of a dying city street lamp, breath visible in the chill, timed like echoes of a shared past, not close enough to touch, but not distant either. The space between them was filled with everything they hadn't said, and all that didn't need saying. Rain had dried on their shoulders, but not in their hearts. It clung in places words couldn't reach. She turned to him, her voice barely louder than a whisper, as if afraid the sound would rupture the fragile stillness. Did you ever stop loving me? The question lingered, not like a wound, but like a photograph pulled from a forgotten drawer, faded, folded, but still intact. He didn't answer. And that was enough, because sometimes silence is louder than any vow, and sometimes the heart beats more clearly in the quiet. A car passed behind them. Headlights swept across their faces, like a slow revelation. For a moment, she looked at him, not the man he'd become, but the boy she once knew beneath all the ruin, the same tired eyes, the same clenched jaw. But now, a vulnerability so raw, it almost felt sacred. She thought about all the years that had passed between them, the lives they'd lived apart, the people they pretended to become, the questions they never asked, because the answers might have changed them. But now, there were no pretenses left, no polished conversations, no timelines or plans, only two people sitting on cold stone, wondering what to do with the warmth still flickering between their ribs. His fingers brushed against the pavement, picking at a line of cracked cement. It reminded her of how he used to sketch when nervous, never looking up, just tracing shapes into the world, hoping someone would notice his silence. She did. She always had. Everything's different, she said, more to herself than to him. Her voice didn't tremble, but it didn't need to. It was heavy enough. He nodded slowly, not because he agreed, but because he felt the truth in her voice. The wind picked up, a soft rustling breeze that tugged at her sleeves and his collar, like the city itself wanted to say something, but knew better. They both stared ahead, into the blurred horizon where streetlights bled into mist. She could hear her own heartbeat again, not loud, not fast, just there, like a steady reminder that she was still choosing what to feel. He glanced sideways, just once, a look that didn't beg or plead, just offered presence. Sometimes that's all you can offer when the past feels too big, and the future still hasn't spoken. There were no apologies left, no reasons, only moments, like this, raw, unscripted, painfully human. She smiled, a small, reluctant curve of her lips, not because anything had been fixed, but because something had finally been understood. They were not who they once were, but maybe, just maybe, they were something still worth holding. A bus hissed to a stop in the distance. A drunk couple laughed as they stumbled down the opposite sidewalk. The world continued turning, unaware of the quiet miracle happening in this forgotten corner. And then, she leaned ever so slightly, just enough that their shoulders touched. It wasn't romance, not yet. It was something more difficult. Forgiveness, maybe, recognition, the beginning of a choice. He didn't pull away. He just breathed in, and for the first time in a long time, he didn't feel like a ghost in his own skin. Minutes passed, or hours. Time didn't matter anymore. What mattered was the feeling, the gentle ache of reunion, the stubborn hope that some things, just some, might survive the wreckage. They sat there long after the world forgot them, two hearts beating separately, but slowly learning how to listen again. And though he never said a word, she heard everything she needed to. But morning found them where the night had left them, not on the pavement anymore, but still close to something raw and real. The sun didn't blaze. It crept in, soft and cautious, like it, too, was unsure if it was welcome. Alina came walking down the sidewalk with a paper bag in her hands. No makeup, no armor, just her, wrapped in a grey coat, eyes gentler than yesterday. The bag crinkled. As she sat beside him again, like it was the most natural thing in the world, she pulled out 2 croissants, warm, fresh, buttery, one for her, one for him. But he didn't eat it right away. Instead, he looked down the street where an old man sat against a brick wall, blanket over his knees, head down, a plastic cup beside him rattling with maybe 3 coins. Without a word, he stood up, walked over, tore his croissant in half, and offered it to the man with both hands. No hesitation, no pity, just a simple, human gesture. The old man looked up. Their eyes met for a second, then a nod, a thank you so soft it barely touched the air. He returned and sat down again, didn't explain himself, didn't look for credit, just bit into the remaining half like it was enough. And for the first time in a long time, Alina didn't just see him, she recognized him. The man she'd loved, the one who used to give away his lunch in high school because someone else forgot theirs. The one who'd sneak out to walk a dog he couldn't afford to adopt. The one who loved people, deeply, sometimes more than he loved himself. He wasn't gone. He was just worn down, bent, not broken. She watched him chew in silence, crumbs catching in the stubble on his jaw, eyes half closed from sleep he hadn't really gotten, and her heart didn't race. It settled. Something inside her breathed again. He didn't thank her for the croissant, but he didn't have to. Gratitude lived in the way he shared it. They ate slowly, no rush. The city around them groaned awake, cars coughing into motion, storefronts rattling open, children dragging backpacks on sleepy feet. But their moment existed outside of all that. Like a pocket of stillness the day forgot. He wiped his hands. On his jeans, Alina sipped from a paper cup of coffee she'd tucked into her coat pocket. She offered it to him after a while. He took a small sip and smiled, just barely. It wasn't the kind of morning people write poems about. It was cold, gritty, uneventful on the surface, but beneath it, a tenderness was unfolding, one that didn't need fireworks or declarations, just small acts of noticing. She didn't say "I missed you," but she leaned into him slightly enough to share warmth, not enough to ask for anything in return, and that was her way of saying it. He didn't say "I'm sorry," but he handed back the coffee with both hands, eyes meeting hers in a soft, tired gaze that asked nothing but understood everything. And that was his way of saying it. People passed there, most didn't look. Some stared for half a second and kept walking. 2 people on a curb, eating breakfast. Nothing unusual, but they didn't know. Didn't see the weight being lifted, slowly, quietly. It was strange how healing didn't come in waves, but in moments like this, a torn croissant, a shared sip of coffee, a stillness held between 2 hearts. She reached into the paper bag and found a napkin, handed it to him wordlessly. He took it, wiped the butter from his fingers, and smiled again, this time a little less guarded. The city moved, and so did they, eventually, but something stayed behind on that pavement, a version of them that didn't need fixing, just remembering. He stood and offered her his hand. She took it, not as a promise, but as a beginning, and for the first time in a long time they walked in the same direction, not as who they were, not yet as who they might be, but as something honest, something new, something worth trying again. Sometimes the quietest moments echo the loudest truths. That morning, the sun broke through winter's haze just enough to cast a faint warmth on the city's worn edges, the kind of light that makes everything seem gentler, even if only for a moment. Alina stood by the doorway of her apartment, holding something in her hands, small, metallic, simple, but to her it felt heavy, like it carried the weight of something unspoken. Rayon stood across from her, shoulders hunched in that familiar way, the way people stand when they've gotten used to folding in on themselves. He wasn't shivering, not visibly, but the air, between them felt cold, like it held a hesitation neither of them could quite shake. She stepped forward, slowly, not to startle, not to invade, just enough for the key in her hand to glint in the light between them. "This is a spare," she said quietly, "for the room down the hall. It's nothing much, but it's warm, clean, yours if you want it." Rayan didn't reach for it, didn't step closer, didn't blink. He just stood there, the silence stretching between them, thick and uncertain. His eyes dropped, not in rejection, not quite, but in the way someone might lower their gaze when the weight of kindness becomes too much to hold. There was shame there, maybe fear, maybe a flicker of disbelief. "I can't," he finally murmured. She didn't flinch, didn't plead, just nodded once, like she already knew, because Alina wasn't offering shelter. Not really. She was offering a kind of return, something harder, a return to dignity, to safety, to belonging. And Rayan wasn't ready. Not yet. He took a step back, slow and deliberate, then another, not running, just retreating. But she followed, not to chase, not to insist, just enough to meet his gaze once more. She reached for his hand and gently pressed the key into his palm. "Then I'll leave it unlocked," she said, "when you're ready." Her voice held no pressure, no timelines, just space, just softness. It was a kind of mercenary, fragile, the kind of thing people don't always know how to accept. Rayan looked down at the key, now resting in his fingers. It was warm from her touch, too real to be a dream, too kind to be expected. He looked back at her, and for a second his eyes glistened, not with tears exactly, but with something just as human. Then he closed his fist around the key and handed it back. "Not today, not yet." She took it silently, slid it into her coat pocket, and stepped aside, leaving the door behind her slightly open. A quiet invitation, nothing more. He turned and walked away, the crunch of his worn shoes on the pavement sounding louder than it should in the stillness. But before he disappeared into the curve of the street, he stopped, just once, looked back, not long, just enough for her to see it, that flicker, that war between who he was and who he was trying to become again. That night, the door stayed unlocked. It stayed unlocked the next night, too, and the one after that. Sometimes she thought she heard footsteps in the stairwell, a pause outside the door, a breath held, then gone. But she never got up to check. She didn't have to, because the room stayed ready. A fresh blanket on the bed, a cup left by the sink, the light bulb replaced in the hallway. Little things, quiet things, preparations, not expectations. And in the silence that followed, something began to shift, not just in Rayan, but in her too. Waiting was no longer a test of patience. It became a rhythm, a heartbeat, a silent kind of hope. She walked past the door every day, glanced at it every night, never locked it. She didn't need to, because sometimes love isn't a grand gesture. Sometimes it's a key you're willing to give, even if it comes back to you. Sometimes it's a door you leave open, just in case someone finds their way home again. And in that quiet hallway, in that still apartment, with a room gently waiting for someone not quite ready, Alina found peace. Not closure, not certainty, but peace. And maybe, someday, that would be enough for both of them. Time doesn't announce when it begins to heal you. It doesn't knock. It just slips in quietly, unnoticed, like the warmth returning to your fingers after too long in the cold. It started with the broom. The bakery needed someone to sweep the back hallway, wipe down tables, carry flour sacks when deliveries came. Nothing glorious. But Rayan took the job without hesitation, no questions asked. Just nodded once, rolled up his sleeves, and started sweeping. He didn't speak much at first, just moved with quiet purpose, like a man trying to prove something to himself, to the world, to her. Alina watched from behind the counter, hands dusted with powdered sugar, breath catching every time she saw him glance up. Their eyes would meet, and something unspoken would pass between them, something fragile, like glass warmed by morning sun. Each day, he showed up early, left late. The lines on his face softened, his shoulders sat a little straighter, and sometimes, when he thought no one was looking, he'd hum to himself low, uncertain, but real. She never said anything about the hum, just smiled and handed him an extra croissant when the morning rush slowed. He'd take it with a quiet nod, eyes down, but lips twitching at the corners. That was their rhythm. Silent exchanges, gentle acknowledgments, a kind of dance neither dared to name. Then one day, he came in wearing a suit, not a new one, not even a good one. It was pressed as best he could manage, with threads fraying at the sleeves and a button missing near the waist, but he wore it like it mattered, like he mattered. Alina looked up from the register and froze. He was holding something behind his back. She could see it, just a flash of white petals poking out from behind his wrist, a daisy dot, simple, honest, just like him. He stepped closer, shoes scuffed but steady, breath trembling ever so slightly. She waited, didn't speak, didn't move, just watched. When he finally reached her side of the counter, he placed the daisy on the marble top between them, then slowly reached into his coat pocket and pulled out nothing, no ring, no box, just an open palm, empty but certain. "I don't have much," he said, voice barely above a whisper, "but I've been sweeping long enough to know. I'm tired of looking down." Alina didn't laugh, didn't cry. She just leaned across the counter, took his hand in both of hers, and held it there quiet and still. And in that stillness, he spoke again. "No dresses, no church bells, no guest list, just us, just this. I want to promise you, the rest of my days, even if all I have to offer is a clean floor and this flower." She could have said yes then. She could have leaped over the counter, wrapped herself around him, and never let go. But instead, she picked up the daisy, twirled it slowly between her fingers, and smiled the way only someone in love can. "The floor's already clean," she said, "so I guess that's one less thing to worry about." They didn't kiss. Not right away. They just stood there, hands tangled, breaths mingling, hearts loud in the quiet of the bakery. The morning sun slipped through the window and landed across the countertop, catching the daisy in its glow. It looked like something out of a postcard, too simple to be grand, too perfect to be staged. Later that week, they stood in the park, beneath the same tree where she first handed him a granola bar months ago. No officiant, no vows written in ink, just spoken promises, raw and trembling. He wore the same suit. She wore a dress she hadn't touched in years, and between them sat a paper bag with 2 muffins, a thermos of coffee, and a folded napkin that read, "Let's build slow, let's stay kind." It wasn't legally binding, but it was real, and for them, real was more than enough. That night, back in the apartment with the door that never needed a lock again, they lay side by side. The daisy, now pressed in a book on the nightstand, leaned like it was listening. No fanfare, no applause. Just the quiet, knowing that some promises, even the smallest ones, can build a whole life when spoken with intention. The world outside moved on faster, louder, always demanding more. But in that little corner of the city, in a room lit by laughter and stories told under old blankets, 2 people rewrote their endings, not with grand gestures, not with perfect timing, but with a broom, a daisy, and a vow, whispered into the quiet of morning light. The bridge hadn't changed. Its stones still bore the same cracks. Its metal beams still groaned with every gust of wind. The city moved above it, as if unaware of the lives it had once cradled below. Yet to Rayon and Alina, it no longer held the weight of sorrow. Not anymore. They arrived just after dawn, before the city fully woke. The streets were hushed, softened, by a light drizzle that misted their hair and clothes. But they didn't rush for cover. They had brought baskets with them lined with bread, thermoses of tea, fruit in brown paper bags. Rayon's hands held the handles steady. Alina's eyes searched the shadows beneath the bridge. They weren't alone. A man with tangled hair peered out from behind a pillar. A woman clutched a wool blanket tighter around her shoulders. There were others, silent, watching, uncertain, stepped forward, not with hesitation, but with memory. Every crack in the sidewalk, every rusted pipe, they were part of him. His steps were not ashamed now. They were steady. Knowing. He placed the first basket gently on the ground. A soft voice said thank you. Alina knelt beside him. Together, they offered what they had once gone without. Sandwiches, soap, socks. Not charity but remembrance. Not pity but presence. This wasn't an act of kindness born from guilt. It was the quiet return of something unfinished. A full circle, not for applause, but for healing. They stayed there for a long time, not speaking much. Sometimes laughter echoed light, surprising, like birds flying between rain clouds. A man offered Rayon a joke. Alina smiled. Someone asked where they were from. Here, Rayon said simply. A child appeared barefoot, eyes wide. Alina reached into the bag, and handed her a croissant, the same kind Rayon had once shared. The girl smiled shyly and ran back into the shadows. Alina watched him. He was no longer the man she once lost. He was the man who had returned, not despite the storm, but through it. Rayan turned to her. The years had left marks on both their faces, but now those lines looked like threads sewn by time, not torn by it. He took her hand. They walked together toward the center of the bridge, the place where it all began. The cold stone where he once lay broken, and she once sat crying in silence. It looked different now, not because the bridge had changed, but because they had. They paused at the railing. The city shimmered ahead, unaware of the small, ordinary miracle happening here. Cars passed. People hurried. But for a moment, the noise faded. They stood as one. Not the couple they had once been, naive, untouched by life's weight, but something fuller, sharper, softer. They had frayed and unraveled and found each other again. Thread by thread, the wind picked up. Alina pulled her coat tighter. Rayan reached into his pocket and pulled out a folded note. Not a love letter. A list. Names of the people they had met under the bridge. People who mattered, who needed to be remembered. He placed the note under a small stone on the railing. Not forgotten, he whispered. A truck rumbled past above them. The bridge shook slightly, but they didn't move. This place, once a symbol of their unraveling, had become sacred, a cathedral of survival, a silent witness. Alina rested her head on his shoulder. There were no crowds to cheer, no photos, celebration. Just two souls who had once been shattered and now stood whole again, not because they were unbroken, but because they had chosen to rebuild. Later, as the sky brightened and the drizzle faded, they walked home. Their hands never parted. Each step forward echoed with memory, but also hope. They passed the alley where he once slept, the corner she had once stood at, alone, the bakery where he now swept the floors, their apartment where the door still stayed unlocked. Love, they had learned, doesn't stay perfect. It bruises, it disappears, it fails. But if tended to, if watered like a dying plant, it returns, changed, deeper, calmer. It stops trying to be loud and becomes something quiet, steady, unshakable. At home, Rayan made tea. Alina lit a candle. They didn't talk much that evening. They didn't need to. Their hearts spoke in a rhythm now all their own. As night settled, he reached for her hand again, and in that silence, in that shared breath, it was clear. Sometimes love gets lost, just so it can be found again.